Okay, you should be able to see the slides now. So once again, good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Jarkoff. I, as mentioned, am with CrowdStrike, and I look after the CrowdStrike threat intelligence business across the Asia Pacific, Japan, as well as the Middle East regions. Just quickly on my background, well, as you heard, I generally am in Tokyo when I'm not on business travel. That's where I've lived for 30 years, and I spent about 25 years with the United States government working both security and intelligence for the vast majority of that time. Today, as Vikas mentioned, the goal is to talk about adversaries that are targeting Indian businesses and to talk about some of the observations that we've had on that adversary behavior front. So I'm going to focus the vast majority of my conversation today on nation state and eCrime, and we'll touch on a few other things here and there, but that's the vast majority of what we're going to be talking about. Here's the agenda for approximately the next 40-ish minutes, give or take. We'll see how long it takes us to get through this. And I encourage you, like mentioned, I encourage you, if you have questions, drop those in chat, and we will be more than happy to address those. Some of those we may keep until later on at the end. Some of those we will answer right away, as mentioned. Sora will be busy able to answer those questions for you. But I want to keep some of like the more interesting ones that may benefit the entire audience. We may keep those for the end of the presentation during that Q&A session. So with that, let's dive right in. So CrowdStrike, we've been around for about 12 years. We're a 12-year-old company. We're most famously known for our EDR product, endpoint detection and response. But really, at the heart of everything that CrowdStrike does is threat intelligence. And with that, it's probably about 10, 11 years ago. So very early on in our life, our CEO, George Kurtz, came up with this mantra around you no longer have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem. And if you really look at how attacks are conducted today, you can't be so focused on a single piece of malware, because if you are, you're going to miss a whole lot of the attack. So think about any modern ransomware attack as a simple example of this. If you're so focused on the ransomware and looking for just the ransomware, it's a whole host of actions that take place prior to that ransomware being deployed by an adversary, a whole series of tradecraft and techniques leveraged by an adversary. That's what you need to be aware of. You need to follow the adversaries. So this is how CrowdStrike approaches threat intelligence, and this is what's going to be the basis for the conversation today. And so I mentioned, we track adversaries and we track crime and hacktivism on pretty much any given day. The vast majority of the activity that CrowdStrike tracks is either nation state or eCrime, and that's very specifically also what we see targeting India. Now, having said that, and I'm not going to get into the geopolitics of it because this is not the right audience or the appropriate venue for that, but with some of the recent geopolitical developments, we've seen, a slight uptick in some of the hacktivism targeting India as a result of some of those geopolitical tensions, if you will, that have risen over the course of the last few weeks. So let's talk about some overarching global trends, and then we'll kind of close the aperture a bit and see, how that relates to India specifically. So, kind of globally speaking, over the course of all of 2022 and thus far, the first, what amounts to the first 9 months of 2023, espionage. Throughout the early stages and latter stages of Corona and the lockdowns, a lot of ransomware, a lot of eCrime, much more than we had seen previously. I'm not saying that eCrime has dissipated, but we've seen an uptick in nation state activity, in particular around the espionage piece. And I'm talking about not just the traditional intellectual property espionage that we're all familiar with, that we're reading about, fairly often, but also political espionage, also surveillance, and things of this nature. We've also seen adversaries that were engaged in some high profile attacks in 2022 and 2023. We've seen some major organizations get hit with eCrime attacks. Some of these were ransomware attacks. In other cases, they weren't ransomware attacks. They look exactly like a ransomware attack, but there's no ransomware deployed. It's just an extortion scheme where the adversary steals data from the victim and then threatens to release the data unless the victim pays some amount of money. So extortion. But a few high profile ones. So I'm sure everyone's heard of Lapsus. That's a solid example of some of the actors that kind of focus on the the high profile kind of being on the big stage type of attack. And so Lapsus is a threat adversary that CrowdStrike tracks as Slippy. In 2021, the focus for a lot of the vulnerability exploitation was 0 days, followed by 2022, where actually a lot of the vulnerability exploitation was focused on older unpatched vulnerabilities rather than the newer vulnerabilities. So we've seen that trend continue in 2023, and we also see the return of adversaries focusing on 0-day vulnerabilities as well. But the penchant for nation states in particular to focus on those older unpatched vulnerabilities that organizations like yourselves reasons, like maybe you cannot install a particular patch because it may end up breaking a particular application. But we've seen adversaries that have very specifically targeted those older vulnerabilities. And we've seen the rise of adversaries that aren't just, able to use the cloud, but have actually become very cloud proficient. So like in one example, a Scattered Spider, which is, pretty much all over the news almost every, I don't know, I want to say every day, but, fairly frequently all over the news, is an adversary that we've seen who's been able to penetrate a network, get into endpoints on that network, and then laterally move from that endpoint up into the cloud, laterally move through the cloud, and then once again drop down to an endpoint on the quote unquote other side of the cloud. So that, and then finally, adversaries,
Hey, Scott,
increasingly
uh,
once.
I'm sorry to intervene. Your voice is dropping in between, so if you can switch off your camera and then let's see how it goes.
Okay,
Thank you.
give me just a second. Okay, camera is off, and let's see how it goes.
Sure.
Uh, as to a network, rather than using custom tooling once they're on the network, they're using existing tools that are either built into the operating system or that are used by the system administrator, using those tools for nefarious purposes. All right, so in 2019, this number was 582 minutes. And then just 2 years later, this number dropped from 582 exponentially to 98. And then this year, it dropped even further to 79 minutes. 79 minutes is what we are referring to as is once an adversary has achieved initial access into a target environment, that first lateral movement from initial access to lateral movement in 2019 took 582 minutes. In 2023, the average is 79 minutes for eCrime adversaries. And we've seen situations where eCrime adversaries are moving laterally, doing this breakout time in as little as 7 minutes. So you can imagine how quick you need to respond in order to stay ahead of the adversary. You need to aim for being faster than 79 minutes, if not even better, just to make sure that you're able to stay ahead of the adversary. So this is the eCrime breakout time for 2023. Now let's talk about some recurring themes that we see targeting Indian businesses, and a lot of this isn't too dissimilar from those kind of global trends, but credential harvesting is a big one that continues to be a problem for Indian businesses, where we are seeing credentials being harvested through either commodity information stealers that are making it onto likely home computers that don't have as good of cyber hygiene as work endpoints, or maybe it's just users being inadvertently tricked into entering their username and passwords where they shouldn't, and then those credentials being sold on criminal markets and criminal forums on the dark web or the deep web, and then an adversary using those credentials for initial access purchases the keys to the front door on a criminal marketplace and then just uses those keys to walk right in the door. They don't have to do any work. It's super, super easy. So this is a huge trend that we're seeing. I'm fairly certain that everyone's familiar with the Move It 0 day that happened earlier this year. I have a slide on it, so we'll talk about it a little bit later. But we've seen this being leveraged quite a bit. The probably the biggest nation state that focuses on attacking India businesses is China, and this has not dissipated, hasn't changed, and it will likely continue. Part of this is due to the espionage that I talked about earlier. Part of this is due to geopolitical tensions, but without a doubt, China is the probably single most nation state adversary that you need to be concerned with. The eCrime ecosystem, which does include ransomware, like just constant ransomware, deployments and attacks are happening on a recurring basis. This is something that's not just, not just a problem for India. This is a problem all across the globe. So, don't feel like this is, just something that you're having to deal with. You read about this in the news every day happening, it could be in Japan, could be in the United States, it could be in Europe, anywhere, right? So ransomware is highly prevalent. It's probably not going anywhere anytime soon. And then the eCrime ecosystem just continues to evolve, where we're seeing adversaries increase in sophistication, adversaries creating specialized tools that are being sold and used by other adversaries. And this just continues to evolve. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So as I'm going through the rest of the slides, I want you to kind of think about this, like, why would your organization be targeted by an adversary, by any of the adversaries? Like, you need to ask the who, the why, the what, the how, and the when. The when really is, probably the difficult part. It's a little bit about being predictive, but the who could be, like a China-based adversary or an eCrime adversary. The why could be the espionage or the financial gain component. The what could be, say, Lockbit ransomware, or it could be ShadowPad, for example, which is used by a China-based adversary. And the how could be that harvested credential that's bought by a criminal on a marketplace and then used during that attack. Or it could be a public-facing web server with a vulnerability that's exploited by an adversary that's used for that initial access. So ask yourselves these questions and think about whether or not you're potentially vulnerable to any of the attacks, and then what you may do to mitigate that. So let's start with the nation state side, and I'll just DPRK, Iran, and Russia. These are the primary and probably most sophisticated of the adversaries that CrowdStrike tracks on any given day from the nation state perspective. And when it comes to who you need to be concerned with, I'd say you need to be concerned with China, DPRK, and probably Russia to a lesser extent, but definitely China without a doubt. So let's go through some of this, and we'll start out with China. And let's just talk about like how over the course of the last 10 years, China has just continued to increase their sophistication. They have very sophisticated tradecraft, and they have a very interesting set of bespoke tools. But increasingly, as I talked about earlier, they're using living off the land techniques. So those tools that are built into the operating system, or legitimate third-party tools that can be leveraged for nefarious purposes. And so when I say that, like a perfect example of that would be to use like remote desktop protocol. A lot of organizations use that for lateral movement around the network by administrators or by the help desk to solve problems or to perform administrative tasks. Well, now adversaries are using that. I shouldn't say now. This has been ongoing for quite some time. So China is no stranger to using living off the land techniques. In terms of volume of attack, the China-based adversaries, which in CrowdStrike parlance means the pandas are without a doubt the most highly operational. Like there's more volume of attacks that are generated from panda adversaries than any of the other nation state adversaries. So very high operational tempo, and their focus primarily is espionage and intellectual property theft. That's their big campaigns. Like on the one hand, they want to steal lots of intellectual property theft to help increase their domestic manufacturing capacity, as well as prop up some of the other industries that they're focused on. The industries that they focus on are basically outlined in each 5-year plan that they release, and they enumerate the industries where they're trying to increase capability. And that's just a very good roadmap for, if your industry, if your organization falls into one of the industries that they're focused on, then you can expect that there's a high possibility that you will be targeted at some point. So intellectual property theft allows China to quite easily catch up to the rest of the world without having to spend, hundreds of millions of dollars and, maybe a decade or two of research and development. Instead, spend a small amount of money on internet access, on computers, and then conduct the attacks quite easily. They also use this for influence operations and domestic surveillance. And I think probably they'll end this with, the what's interesting, I think, to me, is that they have a very societal approach to their like cultivation of highly trained cyber warriors, for lack of a better word. And this starts by identifying very talented individuals early on in the education pipeline. So think about, an elementary school identifying somebody who's very good at math or very good at, some particular subject, yanking them out of that school and then putting them in specialized schooling that can help them turn into those highly skilled cyber warriors. One of the adversaries that I'd say you need to be most concerned with from the Panda side of the house. Normally, I would talk about Wicked Panda, who is probably the most active, the most prevalent, the most sophisticated. But I'd say, right now, Aquatic Panda is probably one that over the course of the last 18 months at least has been exceedingly active, targeting a number of organizations around the globe. In particular, here in the region, we see Aquatic Panda targeting telecommunications providers, technology providers, academia, and then a few others like government and military. But they are highly active, have been active for a little bit over 3 years now, and they are constantly breaching organizations looking to steal data. Now, one of the reasons why they focus on the telcos is because telcos have two things that they're looking for. Two things. One, vast amounts of data. So there's a lot of data to be stolen, so that they can, sweep up large amounts of data, sift through it, and then find what's of importance to them. get internet access? Through a telco, right? So it's very easy to, for a very skilled adversary like Aquatic Panda to breach a telco and then pivot to the actual intended victim. So that's another way into the victim, is by trying to quote unquote backdoor it through the telco, as opposed to going in through some of the more traditional methods. They're actually, the Aquatic Panda, that is actually assessed to be a Ministry of State Security contractor working, sorry, I should phrase this as a contractor working on behalf of the Ministry of State Security in China, and very focused on that economic and geopolitical side of the house. Next would be what we call the Cholimas from very high profile attacks. I think everyone's aware of WannaCry. Everyone is aware of the Sony attack from many years ago. But for DBRK, like it's interesting. On the one hand, they do a number of attacks that are focused on domestic capacity building, which basically very similar to the 5-year plan with China. They have a national economic development strategy that they use that outlines what their focus is, and so they will often undergo a substantial amount of activity to steal intellectual property to help build those domestic capacities. To avoid the sanctions. And the best way to avoid sanctions is to launder money into the country via cryptocurrency. So they're very focused on hitting the financial services industry, hitting fintech, hitting cryptocurrency exchanges, and then using that as a way of generating revenue to bring back into the country. They're very good at social engineering, and also they're very sophisticated at building custom tooling that we don't see used by some of the other adversaries. Now I'm going to focus a minute on like some currency generation here. So Labyrinth Cholima is one of the adversaries that is part of the collective that the industry calls Lazarus. We track Lazarus as 3 separate and distinct groups with distinct targeting, distinct tradecraft, but Labyrinth Cholima is consistently targeting both the fintech and cryptocurrency exchanges, and they're targeting in kind of a globally dispersed nature, but in a very short time horizon. So very small window. They'll go out and they'll hit a lot of tooling with some of their counterparts. In particular, this may lead to why some other researchers think of Labyrinth Cholima, Silent Cholima, and Velvet Cholima as like one monolithic group known as Lazarus. That overlap, but we track them separately, and part of this could come down to some of the tooling that they use. Now, the largest ever cryptocurrency breach was the Ronin Bridge attack that took place this year, 600 million in one attack. And and that was actually, I apologize, in 2022. And then all across 2022, globally, there was about $3.2 billion in cryptocurrency stolen. North Korea is responsible for stealing 1.7 of that 3.2 billion, just from one country alone across 2022. And then on the social media side of the house, so LinkedIn is a pretty solid platform for their targeting. What they will do is they will look for folks like us. They will look for people that are CISOs, people that are administrators, people that are doing IT work. They will pose as recruiters, as talent acquisition. Their profiles on LinkedIn look very legit. And what they will do is they will start up a conversation with an unsuspecting victim, which they will try and locate through the tools that LinkedIn provides. And then they will reach out to that victim and try and get them interested in a job. So through the chat mechanism on LinkedIn is where these conversations begin. Ultimately, the goal is to get the victim off of LinkedIn's chat and onto a tool like WhatsApp. And that's because like there's some security built into the tooling on LinkedIn with, file scanning and whatnot, whereas with WhatsApp there is not that same level of security. And then once they get the unsuspecting victim over to WhatsApp, then, long story short, the goal is to send them victim. Then, once again, long story short, now that machine is basically a cryptocurrency miner that's running in the background. The victim has no idea, and this is contributing now to the cryptocurrency mining operations that the North Koreans are so well known for, and it's all predicated on social media. Social media based attacks, but also social engineering. And then the last on the nation state side would be the bears from Russia. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, and just really want to mention them because of the big four of China, DPRK, Iran, and Russia. Of those four, they're, without a doubt, the most sophisticated of the big four nation state adversaries. They have a very solid offensive capabilities. And for China, for Russia, they don't look at cyber as being separate from like their kinetic capabilities. They don't look at it as being separate from information warfare. It's all part of one, holistic capability. And so that's, I think, a different way of approaching cyber that makes them very, very sophisticated and capable at what they do. They're very effective at targeting industrial control systems and SCADA and operational technology. They, in particular, Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, are highly skilled with the cloud-based environments. So when I say cloud-based environments, think about, like containers, that type of environment. They're very skilled at leveraging those environments, leveraging misconfigurations for their advantage, and using those to conduct their attacks. They're also, as I think we all know, from a few years ago with, like, for example, the SolarWinds attack, and then, multiple other attacks that they've been involved in. They're very adept at targeting the software supply chain. So they're like I said, the most sophisticated of the big four. The house, and I talked about how eCrime is like, an evolving ecosystem. And when we talk about this ecosystem, we can largely break it down into these three buckets. Adversaries that are creating and or providing services to other adversaries, adversaries that offer distribution capabilities, and adversaries that help with the monetization side of the house. And so some of the examples of this would be like access brokers. That is a service. Excuse me. So, access brokers providing that service of harvested credentials so that other adversaries can just purchase those and have the keys to the front door. Ransomware as a service is quite obviously another service. So there's a number of services that adversaries use. Probably access brokers, malware loaders, and ransomware are the big ones that you'll see used quite often. On the distribution side of the house, the adversary has to get like their weaponized documents into the inboxes of their unsuspecting victims, whether through, a targeted phishing attack or through kind of like a broader, a targeted spear phishing attack, or whether through a broader phishing attack, right? So there's adversaries that help with that component and that capability. And then on the monetization side, I mean, there's adversaries that are stealing credit cards and then selling those credit cards. The adversaries that do end up getting paid for a ransomware and or extortion attack, they have to somehow launder that cryptocurrency. They're not just going to take the cryptocurrency where the cryptocurrency payment was made. They're going to launder it. So there's adversaries that even help with that. And so this is an entire ecosystem. This is basically a microcosm of what we are all used to seeing every day in the business world. We see software using or buying into, and it's an entire, business driven ecosystem. The eCrime side of the house is very, very similar, but very specialized towards criminals. as opposed to, legitimate businesses. So let's talk about Bitwise Spider. Bitwise Spider is the adversary that is responsible for the Lockbit ransomware. They've been active since 2019, and they came on the scene in 2019, but they really didn't become popular until Lockbit 2.0 was released in June 2021, and then it's just been insane since then. And then since June 2021, they've had Steelbit, Lockbit 2.0, Lockbit 3.0, Lockbit Black, Lockbit Red, Lockbit Green. Some of these they've built on their own, like the first iterations of Lockbit. Some of the others appear to be derivatives of some of the other tools that we've heard of before, like the Conti ransomware and the Black Matter ransomware. So Lockbit Black, as an example, is potentially a derivative of that. There's quite a bit of overlaps in the ransomware that they've released with those previous tools that I just mentioned, like Conti and Black Matter. So Conti was a ransomware tool that was used for quite some time, a ransomware as a service tool in particular, that was used for quite some time by the adversary known as Wicked Spider, who was also responsible for TrickBot, a banking Trojan, and also responsible for the Ryuk ransomware. Black Matter is the successor to the ransomware that was used during the Colonial Pipeline attack. Because of the Colonial Pipeline attack, that was Carbon Spider who wrote that tooling. Because of the heat that was on that adversary as a result of the Colonial Pipeline attack, they needed to pivot, and they created a new piece of tooling and called it Black Matter, and then they've since basically disappeared. But with Bitwise Spider, I track their dedicated leak site, aka their data leak site, which is the site on Tor where the adversary is constantly posting their victims, and it's every day. It has been more or less nonstop every day since June 2021. Interestingly, the Lockbit Builder, just as a side note, was leaked earlier this year and actually started to become used by some other adversaries, but it hasn't really resulted in anything major. It definitely hasn't decreased the tempo in which Bitwise Spider is conducting attacks. So let's take just looking at time. Let's just take a quick, look through how a Bitwise Spider attack actually occurs. So it starts with that initial access, which is an access broker that is selling access. It could be some remote services, but access brokers is the primary method here, which then once they're in leads to lateral movement. This could be through Lockbit Black, which has a lateral movement capability built into it, but generally through living off the land techniques like RDP, PS exec, etc. Could also be CrowdStrike. Then this is where they try and gain additional credentials. So they'll use living off the land techniques, or they'll use something like mimic, and try and get additional privileges which they can use to increase their access, so privilege escalation. They'll also do some network discovery internally as well with some living off the land techniques. PowerShell probably being the primary one. They'll also try and do a bit of defense evasion. Lockbit Black has this built in, but there's some additional tooling. But this is where they will try and disable certain like legacy tooling and some other types of security software. Once the defense evasion is, once the security software is disabled, then it's essentially game over at that point. And then they'll use remote administration tools. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. They use this for lateral movement and for like essentially administering the environment that they're in. And then they'll use a tool like the MegaSync client. Maybe they'll use Steelbit for exfiltrating the mission critical data, and then ransomware deployment. This is, basically boom. And this is what I was talking about with you got to be familiar with everything that happens before the ransomware. Like if you're focused on just a Lockbit deployment over here on the right-hand side, you're going to totally miss, these other activities that are happening that are, like very strong indicators that a ransomware attack is about to occur. So next is Move It. This is, I think most of us are probably familiar with this, but this was a zero-day exploitation that began as early as May 27th this year, and it resulted in privilege escalation and allowed unauthorized access if leveraged properly. And it was basically a exploit chain. It wasn't like you could just use the one vulnerability and exploit that, and then all of a sudden, bam, you're on and you're good to go. It's like a series of exploits that you have to use together in a chain, and then that would result in the exploit. What I personally found interesting about this is an adversary known as Graceful Spider that was responsible for this. So Graceful Spider's been pretty quiet over the years. They're the adversary that's responsible for the Clop ransomware. So it's not like Clop has disappeared or had disappeared. It's just, the volume of attacks had lowered substantively. And to see Graceful Spider jump on the Move It vulnerability bandwagon was quite interesting. And so their goal was to use this exploit chain as a means of ultimately deploying the Clop ransomware. And so earlier in the year, we saw, quite a bit of activity around Move It vulnerabilities leading directly to Clop ransomware attacks. And similar with Lockbit, they were posting their victims on a day-to-day basis. And so Spider is the name that CrowdStrike uses to denote the eCrime adversaries. And so I've talked about, Bitwise Spider. I just talked about Graceful Spider, and there's quite a few other spiders that are making noise. Piece, being able to go from endpoint to the cloud and then back down to the endpoint. But they're much more capable than that. They also do multi-factor authentication bypass. They do bring your own vulnerable driver. So they're highly capable, and they're in the news quite frequently and have been in the news quite recently as well. Alpha Spider is probably the adversary that's responsible for the second most widely used ransomware tooling today, and that is the ALF-V ransomware. Very, very strong evasion techniques that are built into that piece of tooling. But we've done the analysis on it, and we know what the exploit chain is. We know what the attack sequence is. But something that I thought was interesting about Alpha Spider is that one of the ways that they try and get their victims to pay, if like their victims aren't really paying attention to them, is to get up on LinkedIn and harass those victims on LinkedIn. And as we all know, LinkedIn is widely used for business, business networking, and can be quite embarrassing for an organization to be called out on LinkedIn in this fashion. Solar Spider is an adversary that I've been talking about for the last 2 years, and I will not stop talking about them because we are really the only organization that seems to be talking about Solar Spider and the JS Out Prox remote access tool. This Trojan is a Trojan that is leveraged by Solar Spider, sent out via spear phishing emails as the general rule of thumb, but they are very, very good at targeting financial services institutions with varying themes. They have multiple TTPs. They're very Asian focused, but we have seen them hit India in certain cases as well. And then the last one would be Brain Spider. This is again an adversary that started out as an access broker, but then moved into the ransomware affiliate game using the Radar ransomware. And the Radar ransomware is actually a rebranded version of Lockbit Black, which in itself, as I mentioned earlier, is a derivative of other pieces of tooling. So you can kind of see the ecosystem in action here. So let's talk about the legitimate, use of third-party tools or remote access. I'm sorry, or living off the land techniques. The remote management tools are really the big ones, right? There's a whole host of tools like AnyDesk and Altera and ConnectWise, et cetera, that are being used, and you can see the most widely used ones in 2022 on the fourth line there. But the adversaries are using these tools against you. So, as wonderful as these tools are for remote administration, they're also just as wonderful for adversaries from a nefarious purpose, nefarious use purpose perspective. If you think about like security tools, like how does a security tool differentiate the difference between like legit and nefarious use of like an RMM tool? So scattered spider is actually one of the most prevalent users of RMM tools, and they've been known to deploy up to about 20 distinct tools. So, you got to be really careful with RMM, make sure you're locking it down. But we see a substantial amount of this, and it's increased substantively over the years. And then another one is this notion of bring your own vulnerable driver. So this is a very sophisticated type of attack that happens at the kernel level, and this can manifest in device driver or legitimate driver that is being used that has a vulnerability that has remained unpatched. So you have that one aspect, and then it's used by the adversary for malicious actions, or it could be a driver that's bespoke written by an adversary designed to be a device driver, but is actually in reality designed to be used nefariously, and at the kernel level, gives the adversary access to, substantially more than if they were just to get in through normal means. It's most commonly used for privilege escalation, and in particular to disable the security tooling, right? Because if you have kernel level access, you can, not all the tools, but substantial amount of tools you're going to be able to disable. And scattered spider, as I mentioned 2 slides ago, is using this technique quite often, as well as an adversary also known as outlaw spider. This is likely just going to increase until there's a really solid way to have the operating system prevent this from happening. But we're seeing, adversaries take up interest in this. All right, and then just so to land the plane, since we're just about done and kind of near the end here. So, there's a lot that we talked about, and there's a lot that can be done. But really, in order to like stay abreast of the activities of adversaries, like I've talked about today, that are targeting Indian organizations, it really starts with adversary profiling. It's understanding who the adversary is. This is something that you'll hear people at CrowdStrike say all the time. Know thy adversary. If you know thy adversary, then you know what their tradecraft is, you know how their tooling maps to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and this can help you put in the right security controls to defeat these adversaries, or at the absolute worst, decrease the risk of a successful attack, right? That's the goal. So doing adversary profiling. But I also talked about a lot of harvested credentials. So having visibility into those marketplaces and those forums, and understanding if your credentials are being harvested through either commodity information stealers or through other nefarious methods is absolutely vital now. You cannot have a situation where you do not have that visibility. You need to be proactively monitoring those marketplaces for your credentials, and then also for your own data as well. Also increase the speed in which you're able to conduct correlation on events that are happening in your network. Leverage threat intelligence all across your entire security stack. And then, also don't forget about threat hunting. So, a lot of the attacks that I've talked about today can be thwarted with the right security suite, but there's certain types of attacks that require human-based threat hunting that sits on top of the automated tooling in order to catch that kind of activity. So think about the living off the land techniques that I talked about, and that, like in RDP example, technology is not going to know the difference between nefarious nor legit use of RDP, but humans will, and humans are able to see that indicator. And this is where 24/7, 365 threat hunting is highly, highly important. And then with that, I will leave you with this final word, because this really speaks to everything that I've talked about today, and is really the common language that we can all speak. And it really just comes down to the more you know, the better position you'll be in to decrease those highly sophisticated attacks from being successful. With that, thank you very much for your time today, and I think I'm going to turn it back over to Vikas, and we will open it up for Q&A. So thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Awesome, awesome, Scott. Great session. A lot of excellent insights into it. So really appreciate that. You can come back on camera if you want now. You were breaking in between, but I think should be okay now. So guys, if you want to ask live questions, please go ahead and raise your hand. Before we get into QA, let me welcome Saurabh as well for a couple of minutes. He'll talk about the India Cyber Intel team, right? So Saurabh, over to you. But again, we have only 10 minutes. We have to cover Q&A as well as the closing. So short and crisp, please. And you are on mute.
Yeah. All right. So thanks, Scott, for this wonderful session, and thanks everyone in the crowd for the participation, active participation. Really excellent turnaround as well. Now, there's one important thing that I wanted to share. Because of the emerging threat landscape that we have just heard from Scott, at CrowdStrike, we have recently come up with two big initiatives, one at a global level and one at our regional level. So I'll talk about the global level initiative first, wherein we have launched the CrowdStrike Counter Adversary Operations team. Okay, so it's a team that has been formed comprising of the experts from the intelligence as well as the threat hunting arena. Okay, so both these the team would work together to understand the finer nuances from the telemetry events that we continually get from the customer's environment, as well as our live activities in the underground criminal communities, to detect and disrupt the today's sophisticated adversaries. We have seen a lot of them in this session. And the objective is to raise the cost of doing business for the adversaries, okay, make it harder and harder for them. So that's at the global level. And at the regional level, we have also formed an Intel squad team, again, comprising of the intelligence specialists across the India and SAARC region. And you can reach out to me or the team in case of any clarifications that you may have related to this session or anything related to the regional intelligence after the session as well. So over to you, Vikas.
Great, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's go through the Q&A now. The first question is Scott from Athi Sarita. She's based out of Tokyo, maybe your neighbor. So Athi, over to you. Yeah, you can unmute yourself and ask question, Sarita.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Vikas. Thank you first for arranging this session. And Scott, fantastic session. I missed this touch for quite some time now after I relocated to Japan, honestly. Now, my question is, do you have a similar threat landscape, I would say, or trend for Japan as specifically Japan as a geo? That's one thing, because my view of cybersecurity in Japan, if I have to draw the maturity map, it is pretty nascent, and I think it's pretty easy for hackers to get in.
You are much what's the word I'm looking for here? You're much friendlier with how you would characterize the situation. So I appreciate that. But I mean, the short answer to your question is, yeah, absolutely. I can do pretty much any country, any region, the threat landscape, just because I'm in the intel reports on more or less a daily basis, and I'm constantly tracking the activity of the adversaries. And I've actually spoken a number of times in Tokyo. So the short answer is absolutely we have that.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I will separately get in touch with you for this.
Yeah, definitely get in
Awesome.
touch with me, because I mean I'm probably like Vikas said, I'm probably not too far away, and I'm more than happy to either jump on a Teams or Zoom call, or just meet you at your workplace, whatever works best for you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to next question now. Sushanji, you are up. Sushandi, your question. Moving to Mr. Vikram now. Vikram, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, hi Vikas. Thank you for arranging such a session, because it eventually goes in helping us prepare for the threats, the latest ever evolving threat vectors. And hi Scott, one question for you. Since the crowd, I have been going through, I have not worked with the CrowdStrike, but I have been going through the CrowdStrike data sheets and learned that it's extensive use of AI. Now, from the 0-day and unpatched vulnerability, how effective is it in providing virtual defenses or virtual patching till a concrete solution is put into place? This is my first question. Second is, let's say for any endpoint solution, there is one feature called on an access scan. So, and eventually it ends up taking a lot of time. So how CrowdStrike is taking over this issue? Because there are certain systems, certain places which needs to be pretty fast, and there we have to exclude certain folders to reduce that on-demand scan or on an access scan. So how CrowdStrike is taking over this particular thing?
Okay, so this sounds like maybe more of like an endpoint technology type of like question. So that's really not my expertise. Like my expertise is more around like the adversaries are doing, the techniques that they're using. So maybe Saurabh, if you don't mind me handing this over to you to answer that question, because it sounds like it's probably more along your expertise than mine.
Absolutely, Scott. This is related to endpoint security.
Yeah, Saurabh, so I think you're on mute. Sure. So yeah, it's over to you, Saurabh.
Thanks. In fact, the voice broke for me for some reason or the other. Would you mind just repeating the question, Vikram?
Yeah, the first is from the 0-day and unpatched vulnerability. How is CrowdStrike positioned to defend against these vulnerabilities till a by virtually patching the systems till a concrete solution is put into place? This is my first question. And the second is that there is one feature in endpoint security most of the antivirus has called the on-demand scan. Now it eventually takes up a lot of time, and there are certain systems which needs to be pretty fast, and there we have to exclude certain folders. So how it CrowdStrike position on that front as well?
All right, great question. And starting with the part one of the question, how can we defend against the 0 days in case the patches are not released by the respective OEMs? So that's where our cutting edge technology comes into play, relying on the AI and ML based engines. So we have a look at all the behavioral patterns to understand what all activities are panning up, what are the early warning signs related to it, and then try to block that then and there itself. That's okay. That's one part of it. But there are instances wherein the technology can be bypassed, be it any form of technology of the world. So that's where we have got the human-led threat hunting also included in the game. So that's the second layer of defense, wherein our team of threat hunting experts continually keeps an eye on all the interesting activities going on in your environment. Now, with the word interesting, it may not necessarily be malicious, but even if it is in the suspiciousness radar, we can pick those particular things up and then notify your team through emails, through any other channel to have a look at the things by your SOC team, by providing them a step-by-step remediation guidance. So it's like working in conjunction with your SOC team. So that's part one of the question. Now the second part is the scanning. So of course this has been a problem for the industry imposed by the legacy AV EDR players. Continually scanning your environments, typically and preferably during an off-peak hour interval, which may or may not be a pragmatic approach. So this is the problem that we at CrowdStrike have solved for the entire industry. So while we do have an on-demand scan type of capability, to unravel the already existing threats, already existing risks in your environment. But we are not a proponent of scanning technology. We believe that the technology is rock solid and pretty matured when it comes to the ML and AI engines. So it can pick all those things up on its own and then help you without scanning your environment.
Okay. Thank
Great,
you.
thank you. And we are kind of running out of time, so we cannot take more questions.